Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today in this video I'm going to be doing a bit of a news roundup from the world of Formula One, because there's been quite a lot happening behind the scenes. Although we've not had any racing going on over the last few weeks, I do feel like there's quite a lot moving. There's a lot of stuff happening, rules changing, things being decided on. We've even had cars on track in the last couple of days. So using the SeedStream app, I'm going to be doing a bit of a news roundup from some of the biggest stories that I've seen across the app here that I use all of the time. I'll put a link in the description if you want to go and check out SeedStream. It's a brilliant little app that I use every day now, because it gives a little bite-sized piece of all of the biggest news stories, puts them into one simple post, which you can then go from there to check out the main story, podcast, video, website article, whatever it happens to be. It puts it all into one handy little place every single day, so I find it brilliant. Anyway, let's start with some of these topics. The first one that I've seen here talks about Ross Brawn, where he's been talking about some of the discussions that have taken place around dropping 1 or 2 race results in a season. Now that topic has come up because given that we're in this unprecedented and slightly unique season in 2020, we may have situations when one or more than one driver may not end up being able to take part in a Grand Prix because of either themselves testing positive for COVID-19, or somebody that they've immediately come into contact with, perhaps around their car crew, testing positive for COVID-19, and therefore that driver or those drivers may have to self-isolate for a period of 14 days. Now F1 has no special exemptions from that. That's still going to be the advice that everybody will have to follow. So whether it's a driver or a team member, a mechanic, an engineer, if somebody tests positive, that person and their immediate people that they have come into contact and potentially infected will have to do the same. So the discussion has been had around, should a team be able to drop 1 or 2 race results to cover that scenario? Because otherwise, potentially, it's unfair on the championship results if a championship contender, for example, is forced to miss 1 or 2 events. That discussion, Ross Brawn says in this, was eventually dropped because he says the conclusion we came to is, unfortunately, the teams would game it. And what he means by that is that they couldn't find a solution to prevent the teams from using it tactically. So either, if they're out of the points in a race, abandoning the race, forfeiting the race, dropping out, retiring the car to save engine mileage, that kind of thing. Just dropping a couple of races where they might have a spin or the driver makes a mistake, or they just have some kind of reliability issue that might negate the fact that the rule was set up for this specific reason. Now, it seems to me that there must have been a workaround for this if they really wanted to, but he's absolutely right in that Formula One teams will always find a way to use a loophole like that tactically. So it was discussed, it will not now be happening. Now, Red Bull's Helmut Marko in this story says a couple of quotes that I found interesting. He was talking about the revised 2020 calendar and how reliability can play a really big part, because actually going into the start of the season, we're not going to know actually how long the season's going to be. And therefore, you've got to play it like we may get no further races than the ones that we already have planned in this European section of the season. We may get other races, but we may not. And so any slip up, any reliability problem could be even more costly, as each race could count, if you like, for a larger percentage, a larger chunk of your championship points haul. So that's a factor for everybody, where reliability, not just in terms of the car, but in terms of driver and team performance, is going to be absolutely key. One thing he did say though, which I thought was interesting, Helmut Marko's quoted as saying, "We're expecting a duel between us and Mercedes," so Red Bull and Mercedes. "In our opinion, Ferrari's not at the level of the front runners." And I think that's not a big surprise, in that from pre-season testing, which is kind of all we can go on, Ferrari definitely didn't seem on the pace. But how many times have we looked at pre-season testing and then come the first race or the first few races, things are very different? Helmut Marko openly saying he expects a championship challenge to be between Red Bull and Mercedes. Thoughts on that, if you will? So there you go, that was that one. He also goes on to talk about the way journalists are going to be allowed in. Only 10 journalists from selected outlets will be allowed at the first few races. That 10 journalists will go from Austria over to Hungary, and then there'll be a second group that will do Silverstone and Barcelona, and then a third group of journalists which will take over from Spa and Monza. So very limited numbers, of course, in the media sense, and all of their driver interviews will be done remotely presumably from the media centre. So that was quite interesting. Renault, Cyril Abiteboul, talking about the next generation of power units, talking about the factors that have got to go into these, being the main one being cost. Now, if you're Renault, that's perfectly understandable, and the whole world is taking cost as a more serious factor right now. What they're talking about, of course, it's also got to be ecological. That's a big part of what the next generation of F1 power units will be. But he says we need to get, he says here, in fact, I quote, "I think we need to have the big principle of the engine agreed by 2021 or maybe 2022, so that development of that power unit can start in 2023. He said that's the sort of micro planning that we've got in mind right now. And he talks about the fact that there have been discussions around just dropping the MGU-H from the current setup. His take on this, and it makes absolute sense, is that the MGU-H is one of the things that gives so much efficiency to the power unit. And if we just dropped that, you'd end up having to put a lot more fuel in your car. And he says, his quote is that you would need to put an extra 50 kilos of fuel into the car if we remove the MGU-H in order to get the same kind of energy density from the power unit that we get right now. 50 kilos of extra fuel is not what anybody wants to see, because the cars are already way too heavy and getting heavier. Of course, Mercedes have had cars on the circuit. Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton, both with a day each in a 2018 W09 around Silverstone. And the reason that's really significant and important, obviously it's for a driver perspective. It's great to get back behind the wheel and just to sharpen up reflexes, just to get back into the swing of it. But even more so, perhaps, for the teams, for all the same reasons, and that everybody needs to get back to their normal routines. But when I say that, it's not really a normal routine. There are a whole new set of procedures and protocols that will need to be operated under when we do get back to racing in Austria in just a few weeks' time. And they include things like social distancing to some degree around the garage, wearing personal protective equipment at all times. And those will really genuinely change the procedures that go on in a garage. Now, the guys around the mechanics, it's just not possible to socially distance. And so they will have to wear gloves and face masks and that kind of thing. And they're having to go through rigorous hand washing procedures and all of the normal sensible precautions. But of course, the reason it's so important, as I touched on at the beginning of this video, is that if somebody falls sick and tests positive at some point, the knock-on effects of that, as well as the health of that person or those people that are affected, of course, is a competitive effect on the advantage or disadvantage you may end up with amongst your competitors in the world of Formula One. It can affect your championship. If a key member of your team or key members of your team have to sit out races, if a driver has to sit out races, I mean, you may have to write the championship off. If you've only got a few races, a much shorter calendar, and one of your driver or some of your key personnel have to sit one or two of those events out, that's a big chunk of your challenge, your championship challenge, effectively wiped out. So the essential part, or the necessity to make sure that nobody contracts this virus that's so deadly and so contagious, has to become a real priority for all the teams, even more so than just the health and well-being of the individuals in that team. Something that Valtteri Bottas has mentioned to Sky Sports in their latest podcast, I won't go through the whole thing, but one quote that was interesting was that he has been told by Mercedes, according to him, that Sebastian Vettel is not being considered. Valtteri says, "We've been very honest about what the situation is all the time about contracts, and I got a pretty straight message that no, they're not considering Seb." So maybe that puts to bed the rumours, unlikely though they seemed anyway, of seeing Sebastian Vettel in a Mercedes up against Lewis Hamilton. I couldn't possibly see it myself anyway, but I think that probably puts that one to bed. And I think Mercedes have already hinted towards they're focusing on their current drivers, and beyond that, George Russell and of course Esteban Ocon as well. Let's finish up with this one, reserve drivers. Now, for all the reasons I've talked about just then about the possibility of drivers potentially having to miss races this season, the pressure then falls onto a team to have a decent reserve driver in place. And that's not always a given, because not all teams have them. Some teams only take them to flyaway races because of logistical reasons, as in European rounds, they're much easier to get in and out if they need them in a hurry. But of course now things are slightly different. There aren't as many flights available to any destination, so it's not as easy to move people around in a hurry. So reserve drivers are going to become a little bit more of a focus in 2020, and not everybody even has them officially named. Autosport have done a list of who has what, and some of the drivers are being shared amongst teams. Mercedes, for example, have Stoffel van Dorn and Esteban Gutierrez as potential reserve drivers, but those two are also being shared between Racing Point and then secondly McLaren. Racing Point would get priority if they needed one of those drivers over McLaren, but McLaren would have the option to tap into one of those two should they need a reserve in 2020. Red Bull have Sergio Sette Camara. He's a Red Bull driver in F2, and they also have Sebastian Buemi. What would most likely happen if Red Bull needed a reserve driver is they would take a Toro Rosso AlphaTauri driver, and then AlphaTauri would take one of those two. Ferrari's reserve driver is Antonio Giovinazzi, currently of course at Alfa Romeo, and then they also have Pascal Wehrlein, who's a simulator driver, to tap into as well. So what's most likely is they would probably take Antonio Giovinazzi, which would mean then that Alfa Romeo would then have to lean on Robert Kubica, and Marcus Ericsson has also been a reserve driver for them as well to fill that seat. McLaren, I've told you about. Renault have, in fact, Renault haven't said who they've got yet. Nico Hülkenberg is a potential option for Renault because he's the most recent driver and he's still without a drive. Sergei Sirotkin also has had a relationship with them in the past. Racing Point will have the Mercedes option. Haas, Louis Delatraz and Pietro Fittipaldi are the nominated reserve drivers, but of course neither of them have actual F1 racing experience, so that's an example of how that would really hurt the team potentially if they have to fall on those. And Williams in the past have had links to Mercedes through their reserve driver program as well, but actually just earlier this year it's Jack Aitken, F2 driver, who left the Renault program and is now officially the reserve driver for Williams, so that's who they would potentially fall on if they need to. So some interesting things in place in the background ahead of this 2020 season that's going to be like no other. And I think that these stories are rumbling along all the time. So much changing around 2020, but also 2021, and of course beyond that, 2022. And even beyond that, some really deep discussion happening already about power units for 2026 and beyond. So loads going on, so I thought we'll perhaps do a couple of these building up towards the first race, roundups of news from the SeedStream app that have been happening in the past week or so. I hope you liked today's. I'd like your thoughts on any of those topics, so please do fire them into the comments, and I'll be back very soon. Ta-da!